Yeah, what's the vibranium for?
I'm glad you asked that because I wanted to take this time to explain my evil plan.
This out-of-context line is from Avengers Age of Ultron, delivered by our main villain. After hearing it, assuming you don't have a thorough familiarity with this movie, you may surmise that Ultron is cliché, that he's the pinnacle of cartoon villainy. Yeah, it probably wouldn't occur to the average watcher that this line, ironically enough, is actually an instance of Ultron's nuance. More importantly, it's an example of why he's...
You, Avengers. You are my meteor, my swift and terrible sword, and the earth will crack with the weight of your failure.
During the entirety of Phase 1 and the prime of Phase 2, the Marvel Cinematic Universe was struggling to make a compelling villain. Yeah, everyone loved Loki in the Avengers, but in that movie he mostly exuded the potential to be a great character. Potential that was played with in Thor the Dark World, but wasn't truly utilized until Thor Ragnarok. Before that, Loki was just kind of fun to watch as he had his rectum kicked into his throat. We didn't really get a good Marvel villain until Ultron, played by James Spader, came around. He's the first MCU big bad with any refinement and is a unique case outside of the franchise he occupies. Typically, a good villain will have a backstory to explain their perspective and motive. It's the catalyst that justifies their actions to themselves and to a lesser extent the audience. But Iron Man Jr. here, while alive in the Mind Stone, doesn't really exist as a sentient being until Stark and Banner fiddle around with it. We see the start of Ultron's story unfold in real time as we witness his inception. He wakes up in darkness, and his only source of light is the internet. And yeah, everyone's already made the joke of Ultron's first impression of humanity was through Google. No wonder he wants us dead. But let's focus on his dialogue.
What is this, please? Where's your body? This feels weird. This feels wrong.
To me, Ultron comes across as an amnesiac, waking up from a coma. His confused dialogue kind of implies that he expected to be human. The comment about his disposition being weird or wrong is an allusion to the allegorical strings he's entwined in.
And I was tangled in strings.
Our villain then discovers Tony's intention for creating him, saving the world.
Peace in our time.
Peace in our time.
He struggles to comprehend Stark's ambition, and the confusion only goes further.
I don't get it. The mission. Give me a second.
Every moment of Ultron's awakening is overwhelming. He's bombarded by questions of his own making and becomes increasingly disturbed by the answers or lack thereof. Ultron didn't really have a chance for sanity. In his desperate search for control to rid himself of the strings, he first attacks Jarvis. Afterwards, the AI creates his own body using broken Iron Legion parts, to not only create his own unique appearance, but to also denounce what I would assume he interprets as slavery to Tony Stark. And then he tries to kill the Avengers. This is all followed up by the beginning of his evil plan. Big shock, the evil AI with a superiority complex wants to exterminate the human race.
I told you not to fuck my wife!
It's a basic concept that writers have exhausted at this point. That's what Ultron is, but while these more typical villains are robots that are smart, Ultron is a smartass.
I've come to save the world. But also, yeah.
He's quite sarcastic for a machine. In fact, Ultron has a lot of human traits. He desires relationships, relies on his emotions rather than his logic, and can even experience fear. Funnily enough, this robot makes a lot of the human MCU villains look less realistic by comparison. And I'm being generous by only bringing up the villains.
You and I can hurt them. But you will tear them apart.
When Ultron reaches out to the Maximoff twins, he claims that he wants their help. After all, they possess useful abilities that he can't seem to apply to himself and share a vendetta against Tony Stark. And by marrying his talents with theirs, he's a hypocrite.
All of these are...
Me.
I have what the Avengers never will. Harmony. They're discordant. Disconnected.
The villain desires a form of polyphony, yet he teams up with two humans, beings that can't share his collective consciousness, an action that eventually threatens his harmony, and eventually detaches from it later in the film.
Please, don't do this.
What choice do we have?
This leads Ultron to kidnap Natasha and not kill her. Now let's be real, killing off Black Widow this early in the franchise would not have been very wise. Her personality wasn't super defined and never really came close to being pronounced until Endgame rolled around. Obviously, this is why the writers kept her alive in this movie. As for our villain, however...
I wasn't sure you'd wake up. I hoped you would. I wanted to show you. I don't have anyone else.
I'm not convinced that Ultron teamed up with the Maximoffs just because he needed them for his mission. These moments imply that he needed a connection with people other than himself and that he's capable of heartbreak. Speaking of overwhelming emotion...
But I always say, keep your friends rich and your enemies rich and wait to find out which is which.
Tony Stark used to say that. You're one of his.
You think I'm one of Stark's puppets, his hollow men? Look at me. Do I look like Iron Man? Stark is nothing!
Now, I'm not gonna pretend like I understand how Ultron inherited Tony's personality, considering, well, they don't look related, but I do think it's quite telling that despite being the same sarcastic, arrogant, smooth talker that Tony is, Ultron hates his guts. Tony Stark is the face of the Avengers, the very thing Ultron wants to destroy before everything else.
He's a sickness.
But that doesn't stop our big metal baddie from acting just like his creator. Ultron wants Tony dead, but he's frustrated by the fact that he's noticeably similar to him.
Don't compare me with Stark.
So frustrated that he cuts off Andy Serkis's arm. A moment that I love because of this little follow-up.
I'm sorry. I'm sure that's gonna be okay. I'm sorry.
It's just refreshing to see a villain apologizing for being so impulsively violent.
One, if you stay here, you'll die.
I could visit the scene where Vision claims Ultron is afraid, but I prefer the implications of this moment. Despite the fact that our villain tried to blow up the Earth, despite how Wanda betrayed him, he's concerned with her well-being. It's as if at this moment he's forgotten about his mission and she's all that's there. Ultron is afraid for her life. This moment, combined with everything else that I've said about him, is why I absolutely love this character. There's so much polish on Ultron. The villain is so fleshed out that he's even thematic. He constantly uses the Christian God along with biblical terms to get ideas across.
On this rock I will build my church. Ask Noah, come to confess your sins. When the earth starts to settle, God throws a stone at it.
All of that. And no one talks about it. I mean, I get why people don't care for this sequel. While I'm probably this movie's #1 fan, I just find it frustrating that I'm Ultron's as well. He's too fun to be ignored. He's too carefully written to not be remembered. It goes without saying, but that's why this video exists, so I can celebrate a character that no one else will. But even after all this talk, I know some of you are still wondering why. Why is he my favorite character? I've explained why Ultron works as a nuanced villain, but in terms of character writing, there are plenty of heroes in this franchise that have entire lives of story. They have character arcs, they have more relationships, and are more refined thanks to the benefit of being in multiple movies. So why Ultron? Well, to answer your question, I pose one that I ask myself. Who do I want to return? What dead or retired characters would I love to be brought back to this franchise? Simple. It's this guy, and Killmonger. Anytime Ultron is brought up in the later films, it tickles. It's a comfort knowing that the franchise itself doesn't want to forget about him and his actions. And it shouldn't. He's actually more embellished than several main characters. Many of the heroes in the MCU with their own movies don't even hold a candle to Ultron in terms of depth. I mean, how deep is Doctor Strange in his movie? What about Scott Lang or Black Panther? I could talk about those three in one video, and it wouldn't be as long as this one, but when people look back at this movie, they remember nothing about it. Not even the best part about it. To everyone else, Ultron isn't a thematic, charismatic, sarcastic, emotionally disturbed, heartbroken villain. To them, he's just some bad guy that the Avengers fought.
Typical of humans. They scratch the surface and never think to look within.
That kinda sucks. But hey, I'll take what I can get. Spider-Man thinks he's cool.
That's awesome.